Formula One in the 1980s was all about turbo power. Renault introduced the first turbocharged engine in 1977, and their rivals gradually followed suit after ground effect was banned and engine power began to supersede downforce and grip. By 1986, turbo power was being pushed to its extremes, with engines that could put out up to 1400 brake horsepower, but be written off after only a few laps. The introduction of pneumatic valve springs in 1986 had also facilitated engine speeds of up to 12,500 RPM. This system was both expensive, wasteful, and dangerous, and so, in 1989, the FIA made the decision to ban turbo power completely. If you want to learn more about the turbo era itself, click on this video here. 12 of the 18 teams competing in 1988 switched to naturally aspirated power 1 year early in preparation for this ban, and the new regulations for 1989 stipulated a maximum engine capacity of 3.5 litres, but in any configuration of your choice. If you like this content and wish to see more, you can help me out by clicking the subscribe button and the bell icon and joining as a channel member, but let's carry on. When 1989 came about, the majority of teams chose V8 engines, which had been the engine of choice for most teams in the pre-turbo era, and had the advantage of being small, lightweight, more fuel efficient by running at lower revs, and cheap. However, they were down on power, with the Ford Cosworth DFR being run by AGS, Arrows, Benetton, Coloni, Ligier, Minardi, Onyx, Ozella, Real, Scuderia Italia, and Tyrrell, putting out 620 brake horsepower. The Judd CV and EV V8s used by Brabham, Eurobrunn, Leighton House and Lotus put out even less at 610 brake horsepower, and Zaxspeed stood alone with their Yamaha OX88 V8 which produced a trifling 560 brake horsepower. Ferrari and Larousse chose V12 engines, which had been very popular in the late 1960s. V12s were powerful and offered a smooth power delivery, but had the catch of being large, heavy, expensive, thirsty, and not particularly reliable. Ferrari's in-house Tipo 035/35 V12 produced 660 brake horsepower, and the Lamborghini LE3512 V12, designed by former Ferrari technical director Mauro Forghieri, produced 600 horsepower. McLaren and Williams, however, decided on V10s, which had never been used in Formula One before, but offered the best compromise between weight, power, and fuel efficiency. Honda had begun a collaboration with McLaren in 1988, previously being Williams and Lotus's engine supplier. The RA167E turbocharged V6 used by Williams in 1987 produced 1200 brake horsepower in qualifying trim and 800 brake horsepower in race trim. The RE168E used by McLaren in 1988, which had a reduction of turbo boost from 4 bar to 2.5 bar, dropped down to 675 brake horsepower. But the RA109E, which lacked the turbo but had 4 extra cylinders and had a capacity 2 litres larger, was able to match this. After Honda left Williams for McLaren in 1988, Williams used Judd V8s as a temporary stopgap, but then struck a deal to use Renault V10s from 1989, who had left Formula One as a constructor and engine supplier 3 years earlier. The Renault RS1, designed by Bernard Dudot, produced 650 brake horsepower, slightly down on Honda, but the V10 formula worked, as McLaren and Williams finished first and second in the Constructors' Championship respectively. No other teams adopted V10 power in 1990, though new team Life attempted a W12, which went about as well as you could imagine, and Coloni tried a Subaru Flat 12, which gave the car the properties of an overpowered go-kart. McLaren dominated again, but with close competition from Ferrari, whose V12 worked well in the hands of Alain Prost, but it was Ayrton Senna who took the title. Ferrari's V12 was only marginally down on power to McLaren's Honda V10, and suffered with poor power delivery and low-speed corners, but they made up for this with good aerodynamics. In 1991, McLaren decided to follow this example and Honda built a V12. Power skyrocketed to 780 brake horsepower, which allowed them to take both titles once again, the only ones for a Formula One car with a V12 engine, despite Williams continuing to use V10s and being joined by 3 other teams. When Tyrrell signed Satoru Nakajima for 1991, he brought with him the contract that had been the key to him first joining Lotus in 1987. They ran the Honda V10 that McLaren had used in 1990, but as Honda were now focused on development of their new V12, this engine was maintained by Mugen, becoming Mugen Honda. Leighton House switched from a Judd V8 to an Ilmor V10, who were making their debut as an engine supplier, and Scuderia Italia switched from a Ford Cosworth V8 to a Judd V10. These three teams enjoyed plenty of power, but aerodynamic inferiorities restricted them to the midfield. Williams had a car that could match McLaren, but a whole host of new technologies and components made it very unreliable and cost them both titles. In 1992, Williams sorted out this reliability, and through the use of semi-automatic transmission, active suspension, ABS and traction control, came to dominate, with a Renault V10 now rated at 750 brake horsepower, which meant they had no rivals, and Nigel Mansell stormed to the title. McLaren, in the next best car, continued to use a Honda V12, which beat Williams on power with just over 800 brake horsepower, but lacking the electronic driver aids which meant they could not keep up. Elsewhere, Andrea Moda, Brabham, Footwork and Ligier all adopted V10 power. Andrea Moda and Brabham used the same Judd V10, but Brabham rarely if ever qualified, and Andrea Moda were clearly shortchanged by whomever sold them their engines. Ligier joined Williams in using Renault power. Footwork took on Mugen Honda engines with the arrival of Aguri Suzuki, and Tyrrell switched to Ilmor engines alongside March. In 1993, Honda withdrew from Formula One due to a global recession. Ron Dennis attempted to strike a deal to get Renault's V10s, but instead had to settle on Ford V8s, which produced less than 700 brake horsepower. Williams dominated yet again, and their Renault V10s were now rated at 780 brake horsepower. 2 years later, the engine from this car would be used to power a special edition of the Renault Espace. Ligier with the same engines finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Tyrrell switched to Yamaha V10s after signing Ukyo Katayama, and Jordan switched from Yamaha V12s to Hart V10s, which at 700 brake horsepower were only marginally more powerful than a V8. New Team Sauber entered the sport with their own Sauber-branded V10s, which had actually been designed by Ilmor in partnership with Mercedes-Benz, who before this had been very successful together in the World Sports Car Championship, and it also marked Mercedes-Benz's return to Formula One after a 38-year absence. In 1994, McLaren returns to V10 power. The previous year, Ayrton Senna and Mika Hakkinen tested the MP48 with a Lamborghini V12, and despite being fully aware of that engine's poor track record up until that point, they concluded that they could have won the title with this engine, but had already settled on a deal to run Peugeot V10s for 1994. These engines, however, were extremely unreliable, and so this partnership lasted only 1 year. The banning of all electronic driver aids ended Williams' dominance, and despite breaking the 800 brake horsepower barrier at over 14,000 RPM, they were being matched by Michael Schumacher and Benetton in a much less sophisticated car with a Ford V8 that produced 740 brake horsepower. They did also test the FW16 with continuous variable transmission, which would have allowed Renault to optimise the engine to operate at a fixed RPM, but it was banned after Ferrari complained. Sauber decided to rebrand their Ilmor-built V10s as Mercedes-Benz, which produced 750 brake horsepower. Lotus, for their final year in the sport, used Mugen Honda V10s, but these were less powerful than Benetton's engines, and New Team Pacific used cheap but dated 2-year-old Ilmor V10s previously used by March and Tyrrell with less than 700 brake horsepower. The deaths of Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger early on cast a shadow over the season, and there was a lot of suspicion regarding the legality of Benetton's car, as all their drivers, including Schumacher, conceded it was a nightmare to drive, and had almost 100 brake horsepower less than Williams, and yet could still keep up with them. They were cleared of any wrongdoing, despite the car's ECU still containing the software that ran traction control, but Schumacher himself was disqualified from 2 races and banned from 2 others, but still scraped the driver's title from Damon Hill by just 1 point. Several short-term solutions to slow the cars down had been introduced in 1994, but in 1995 a more long-term one came as maximum engine capacity was reduced from 3.5 litres to 3 litres. Despite a drop in power, engine speeds rose sharply, getting above 15,000 RPM. In tandem with this, McLaren switched to Mercedes power, getting factory team status in the process, which forced Sauber to switch to Ford V8s. Benetton as well became a Renault Works team, getting the engines free of charge, now having the same power unit as Williams, putting in 700 brake horsepower. These engines had been transferred over from Ligier, which was part-owned by Benetton's CEO Flavio Briatore, and he convinced Mugen Honda to supply their engines to Ligier, which had originally been intended for Minardi. Minardi sued Mugen Honda, and the matter was eventually settled out of court, and Minardi adopted Ford V8s and were paid $1 million in compensation by Briatore. Jordan also took on McLaren's engine deal with Peugeot, but they had all the same problems. Ferrari, meanwhile, had persisted in using V12s, and by the end of 1994 they were producing 850 brake horsepower, which up until then was the most powerful naturally aspirated engine in Formula 1 history, matching the turbocharged cars in race trim. Even with the reduction in engine capacity, the Tipo 044/1 still produced 750 brake horsepower. They had continuously stuck their heads in the sand regarding their engine's poor reliability, but in Canada, Jean Alesi took their first win in 5 years, and also the last ever for a Formula 1 car with a V12 engine. Williams had by far the best aerodynamics, but Benetton now using the same engine put them on more of an equal footing, and even though Benetton's car was still very twitchy and difficult to drive, Schumacher comfortably took the title following a series of operational and driver errors from Damon Hill and Williams. In 1996, Ferrari built their first V10 engine, and they were also joined by Michael Schumacher, beginning a marked shift in their fortunes. Ferrari's car was aerodynamically poor, and Benetton's had been designed with Schumacher in mind, which meant former Ferrari drivers Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger were not able to fully extract its performance potential. Despite continuing to share the same Renault V10 with Williams, which now reached over 16,000 RPM, Williams once again had by far the best aerodynamics, and by sorting out their previous errors, it was a relatively easy run to the title by Damon Hill. Meanwhile, Ford built V10 engines for Sauber, which ended up being troublesome compared to the previous year's V8s, and the only teams now without V10 engines were Footwork, Minardi and Forti, who were the bottom three in the Constructors' Championship, with Footwork's Hart V8 being the most powerful at 680 brake horsepower, while Williams' Renault RS8 was rated at 760 brake horsepower. In 1997, Tyrrell decided to switch from Yamaha V10s to Ford V8s, in the interest of better reliability, but found themselves massively down on power. A returning Arrows taking their Yamaha deal, and new team Stewart using Ford V10s, meant the only other V8 teams were Minardi and MasterCard Lola, who lasted only one race. Williams were leading the pack once again, but Schumacher's input and him bringing over several key staff from Benetton meant Ferrari closely challenged them. Another controversial title-deciding move from him, however, meant the title went to Jacques Villeneuve. Damon Hill had been controversially replaced at Williams by Heinz-Harald Frentzen, and he joined Arrows for 1997. The Yamaha engine was not particularly powerful, at 700 brake horsepower at 14,000 RPM, and the car itself not particularly reliable, which cost Hill a potential win in Hungary. McLaren were in the third year of their partnership with Mercedes-Benz, but were relegated to third fastest. Sauber struck a deal with Ferrari whereby if they signed Ferrari's test driver Nicola Larini, they could have their previous year's V10s, which were rebadged as Petronas as a homage to the team's sponsor Petronas Oil. Larini left after only 5 races, but they got to keep the engines. Now retired driver Alain Prost brought out Ligier and renamed it Prost Grand Prix, and they ran the car that Ligier had originally designed for 1997 with the same Mugen Honda engines. Several major changes came in 1998. To slow the cars down even further, the maximum track of the cars was reduced from 2 metres to 1.8 metres, and with this also came an extremely controversial decision to outlaw slick tyres and introduce 3 grooves in the front tyres and 4 in the rear, becoming 4 as well in the front in 1999. Minardi and Tyrrell both adopted Ford V10s, which meant Formula 1 had its first ever all V10 grid, and so this is where the V10 era truly begins. Renault left Formula 1 again at the end of 1997, but allowed Williams and Benetton to continue using the 1997 engine in 1998. Williams was rebadged as Mechachrome and Benetton's as Playlife. This, combined with Adrian Newey moving to McLaren, meant Williams' reign came to an end and they were demoted to third fastest, and Benetton also losing several key staff to Ferrari meant they drifted back into the midfield. Adrian Newey's input at McLaren put them back at the front, as he gave them state-of-the-art aerodynamics and worked closely with Ilmor to make these complement the engine, which was set low in the chassis to improve weight distribution, and produced 760 brake horsepower and could now go up to 17,000 RPM. This could break 800 brake horsepower at brief moments, however, as McLaren had designed a sort of proto-ERS that would use braking energy to charge batteries that could give an extra 40 brake horsepower. The previous year, they had also developed brake steering with the use of a second brake pedal, and continued this in 1998. However, it was banned after one race following a protest from Ferrari. Schumacher's dream team was now in full swing, and though they had worse aerodynamics, a more powerful engine rated at 805 brake horsepower at 17,300 RPM and Schumacher's driving made up for that. The result was a tense title battle between him and Mika Häkkinen. Häkkinen was especially good in qualifying, as Schumacher's only pole positions came in the final 3 rounds, but Schumacher still took 6 wins to Häkkinen's 8. He was denied a chance to take the lead in the championship after colliding with Häkkinen's teammate David Coulthard while lapping him at Spa, and then at the season finale stalled from pole position, and had his meteoric charge through the field stopped dead in its tracks by a puncture, handing Häkkinen the title. Elsewhere, Jordan and Prost did an engine swap, with Jordan taking on Mugen Honda engines and Prost Peugeot. Prost's first car of their own design, however, was abysmal, with a heavy engine that broke a lot, and they only scored a single point. Jordan's Mugen Honda engine was among the least powerful, at 690 brake horsepower at 13,800 RPM, and the car's aerodynamics were also poorly designed, until a complete overhaul by Mike Gascoigne mid-season that gave them a 1-2 at Spa. Arrows decided to part ways with Yamaha and brought in Brian Hart to design an engine in-house, which made them the first British team to design their own engine in over 20 years. The engine's deficiencies meant, however, that they were only competitive at non-power dependent circuits like Monaco and endured 8 double retirements. Minardi and Tyrrell shared the same Ford V10, while Stewart, as Ford's factory team, got the uprated version, and those two teams fought at the back of the grid. Little to no regulation changes in 1999 meant the cars themselves changed very little as well. McLaren and Ferrari crossed swords again, but when Michael Schumacher crashed and broke his leg at Silverstone, he had to sit on the sidelines for 7 races. Teammate Eddie Irvine, however, managed to take the title battle against Mika Häkkinen to the final round, as Häkkinen crashed for the lead at Imola and Monza, and had mechanical failures in Melbourne, Silverstone and Hockenheim. Despite that, he just hung on to take the title. McLaren now had the most powerful engine, rated at 810 brake horsepower at 17,000 RPM, and better aerodynamics than Ferrari, but David Coulthard suffering another 6 mechanical retirements meant that, despite their troubles, and controversy over their barge boards, Ferrari took the Constructors' title. Jordan picked up where they left off, and in the third fastest car, Damon Hill was abysmal, but Heinz-Harald Frentzen was, for a time, a title contender, and took 2 wins. Williams had their now 2-year-old Renault RS9 engines rebadged once again as Supertech, a Dutch company owned by Flavio Briatore, and Ralf Schumacher got regular points, but Alex Zanardi did not enjoy the grooved tyres and failed to score any. Tyrrell was bought out by British American Tobacco and renamed BAR. They too used these Supertech engines and had high hopes of winning races, particularly with Jacques Villeneuve at the helm, but non-existent reliability meant they didn't score a single point. In 2000, V10 engines were made mandatory as a cost-cutting exercise to prevent teams using resources and money to potentially develop other engine types, but in practice it made no difference as everybody was running V10 engines anyway. There was almost nothing in it between McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari increased the V angle of their engine from 80 degrees to 90 degrees, which lowered the centre of gravity and improved balance. McLaren still had the best overall package, and their Mercedes engine was now approaching 18,000 RPM, but Schumacher's driving once again made up for that. He and Häkkinen both had mechanical issues at different points, and they fought even harder and closer than in the previous 2 seasons, but at the penultimate round at Suzuka, Schumacher secured Ferrari's first driver's title in 21 years. In 1998, Williams signed an engine deal with BMW, which came into effect in 2000, marking BMW's return to Formula 1 13 years after last supplying engines to Brabham. BMW's turbocharged engines in the 1980s have been among the most powerful, and their new V10 proved no exception, with the E41/4 putting out 810 brake horsepower at 17,500 RPM. However, they were still resigned to third fastest. BAR themselves also abandoned the Supertech engines and struck a deal to become a Honda Works team, who returned to Formula 1 after last supplying V12 engines to McLaren in 1992. This again was a powerful engine rated at 810 brake horsepower at 17,000 RPM. And by focusing on improving reliability, they finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Ford bought out Stewart completely for $154 million and renamed the team Jaguar, who they owned at the time. The engines were also rebadged as Cosworth, but during their tumultuous tenure they were confined to the midfield. Jordan continued using Mugen Honda engines, but these were relatively underpowered, and a crippling lack of reliability meant they lost any further chances of competing at the front. Arrows fired Brian Hart midway through 1999 and abandoned their in-house engine program and adopted Supertech engines, the same as Benetton's Playlife branded units, but points were rare for both teams. Minardi continued to use the same Ford Zetec V10 they had used since 1998, but now rebadged as Fond Metal, who had competed as a team in their own right in 1991 and 1992, and it was unsurprisingly the least powerful on the grid, at 770 brake horsepower at 15,800 RPM. In 2001, the decision was made to reintroduce traction control, launch control, and fully automatic transmission from the 5th round onwards, which had all been banned since 1994. It was done to ensure no one was cheating, because now everyone was cheating, so to speak. Bridgestone had been the sole tyre supplier for Formula 1 since Goodyear's withdrawal in 1999, but Michelin re-entered the sport after leaving in 1984, and supplied tyres to Williams, Benetton, Jaguar, Minardi and Prost. Ferrari built a car with McLaren's design philosophy in mind, and they introduced a distinctive drooped nose to compensate for new regulations mandating a raised front wing. This car had excellent tyre wear, and so they broke ahead of McLaren, and Schumacher took his 4th driver's title with 9 wins with relative ease. McLaren's car development was beginning to stagnate, and Hakkinen had a huge loss of form and retired at the end of the year, but Coulthard just about managed to finish runner-up. Williams seemed like they were on the road back to success. They now had comfortably the most powerful engine on the grid, with the new BMW P81 putting out a colossal 880 brake horsepower at 18,000 RPM. Former Indy 500 winner Juan Pablo Montoya also joined the team and came in like a freight train, not afraid to fight the established names. Their downfall, however, was that the engine's extreme power made it very unreliable, and the car was also not particularly strong at high downforce circuits. As a rookie, Montoya also made several errors and finished only 6 of the 17 races, but 4 wins from him and Ralf Schumacher still gave them 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. Renault returned to Formula 1 once again, and built a new engine for Benetton that sat at an unusually wide V-angle of 111 degrees, which, while lowering the centre of gravity, made the engine very fragile, and only a handful of points were scored. Jordan replaced their Mugen Honda engines with full works Honda engines, identical to those used by BAR. The car ended up being very strong in qualifying, but its race pace was poorer and it was very unreliable, like its predecessor, and they failed to get a single podium. When Renault returned as an engine supplier, they bought out Supertech, and so Arrows signed a deal with French company Asiatech to use the Peugeot engines formerly used by Prost in 2000. The car had a small fuel tank, which necessitated aggressive race strategies, and they attempted to run a distinctive raised front wing element at Monaco, which was quickly banned and scored only a single point. Sauber's car was a relatively conservative design, aside from the innovative use of a twin-keel front suspension mounting, but they had a forward-thinking driver lineup of a rising Nick Heidfeld and the somewhat enigmatic Kimi Räikkönen. Prost dropped their Peugeot engine deal and took on the 2000 spec Ferrari engine but rebadged as Acer. Their first season, where they used a car built by Ligier, ended up being their most successful, and they folded at the end of the year. Giancarlo Minardi sold his team at the 11th hour to Paul Stoddart, CEO of European Aviation. The car was built in haste and still used the same aged Ford engine, now rebadged as European, but the team did give a young Fernando Alonso his debut. Aside from a chaotic first race, 2002 ended up being a largely forgettable season. Michael Schumacher broke new ground by finishing on the podium in every single race and took his 5th driver's title with a record 6 races remaining. There was also controversy as team orders were utilised for teammate Rubens Barrichello to needlessly hand him the win at the last minute in Austria. The F2002 was lightweight and compact and only increased Ferrari's advantage. Up until this point, Mario Illien at Ilmor had built McLaren's engines with aluminium-beryllium alloy pistons and piston casing, which due to its greater resistance to heat than steel and copper, meant they could match their rivals on power and revs with a longer stroke. This was now banned, and the engine's V angle was increased from 72 degrees to 90 degrees. This ended up being very unreliable, and Coulthard got only a single win, and Raikkonen suffered 10 retirements. Williams continued to break power records, as in qualifying trim they could now reach 940 brake horsepower at 19,000 RPM. With this, Montoya took 7 pole positions and set a new average lap speed record at Monza, but the unending reliability issues meant he failed to get a single win. Renault bought out Benetton completely, marking their return as a full constructor after first leaving in 1985. A fast car was compounded by poor reliability, meaning they didn't get any podiums. Arrows and Minardi did an engine swap, as Arrows took on Cosworth engines and Minardi took on Asiatex. Arrow's financial struggles caught up with them and they folded mid-season, but their last car, the A23, would be used in the future in some form by Minardi, Super Aguri and Marussia. Rookie driver Mark Webber scored 2 points for Minardi on his debut. Having the least powerful engine, with a mere 800 brake horsepower at 17,500 RPM, and a not particularly good chassis, meant they scored no other points but secured 9th in the Constructors' Championship. Toyota entered Formula 1 in 2002, becoming the latest manufacturer to do so, and the first entirely new constructor in 5 years. They had built a complete car a whole year in advance just to be used for testing, and they were investing an enormous amount of money in this project, but their in-house engines were average, and during their time they struggled to get out of the midfield. A lot changed in 2003. Points were now awarded to the top 8 finishers to reward consistency, and one-lap qualifying was introduced, spread over 2 days. The tyre war between Bridgestone and Michelin also came into full effect. Ferrari's new car was harsh on its Bridgestone tyres, which suffered at many races due to a Europe-wide heatwave taking place that summer. McLaren, who had switched to Michelin tyres, and the already Michelin-shod Williams mounted a serious challenge to Ferrari, but this came to an end with 3 races remaining, when Bridgestone noticed that Michelin's tyres deformed beyond the maximum tread width during races, even though said width was only measured before races. The FIA listened, and Michelin were forced to change their tyre compounds, and Michael Schumacher clinched his record-breaking 6th driver's title by just 2 points. McLaren had been using the same basic design concept since 1998, which had initially served them well, but they were now falling behind. Adrian Newey began working on a radical new car for 2003, the MP418. He took the twin-keel suspension mounting pioneered by Sauber in 2001 and flared the keels outwards in a waved wing design, which acted as a diffuser for the front of the car. Patrick Head at Williams came up with this idea for the FW25 independently. The rear bodywork was tightened up hugely in a similar fashion to what Ferrari had done with the F2002, with very narrow side pods, and exhausts moved into the diffuser, bringing back the blown diffuser concept. The nose cone was also made very narrow and very stout so that the front wing protruded outwards. Ilmor designed a new engine that sat very low in the chassis, but due to the extreme confines of the bodywork, it was very difficult just to get it in and out of the car. They also built a new titanium carbon fibre alloy gearbox, but this too was difficult to get in and out and was surprisingly fragile. The car was very good aerodynamically, but during testing the tight bodywork meant the engine and gearbox were constantly overheating. Alex Wurz and Kimi Räikkönen both had major crashes testing the car, and its planned debut was eventually shelved. McLaren were reusing the MP417 again as a temporary stopgap, as the MP417D, but ended up having to use it for the entire season. Despite its age, it was competitive as McLaren had alleviated a lot of its previous reliability problems, and because of Ferrari's aforementioned tyre wear issues. Despite getting only a single win, Räikkönen led part of the season and lost the title to Schumacher by just 2 points, but McLaren finished third in the Constructors' Championship, just 2 points behind Williams in second. Williams cranked their BMW engines up even further, and massively revised their aerodynamics. They, like McLaren, benefited from Michelin's very wide tyres, and Montoya went on a run of 8 consecutive podium finishes. They however dropped off even more than McLaren when these tyres were changed, but still clinched second in the Constructors' Championship. Renault kept their distinctive 111-degree angled V10 despite its problems, but Fernando Alonso took his first win with it. Jordan lost their Honda engines, who wished to prioritise BAR, and so they hastily adopted year-old Cosworth engines rebadged as Ford. It was a terrible season, aside from in Brazil. The FIA had controversially mandated only a single wet tyre compound for 2003, and in this race numerous drivers fell by the wayside, and Giancarlo Fisichella was given the win several days later, following confusion over the final classification. Minardi changed engines yet again as Asiatech collapsed. They tried to get a Ferrari deal, but this was too expensive, so settled on 2002 spec Cosworth engines run by Jaguar, who, as the works team, had the latest model, which was almost 100 brake horsepower more powerful. They also lost their Michelin deal and secured Bridgestone tyres right at the last minute, but finished bottom of the standings with no points. In 2004, launch control and fully automatic transmission were both banned, but traction control remained. Also, for the first time since the turbo ban in 1989, no teams changed engine suppliers. Engines were also mandated to have to last an entire race weekend. The Ferrari F2004 reverted back to the design concept of the F2002, and it ended up becoming the pinnacle of car design in the V10 era. The engine put out 940 brake horsepower at 19,000 RPM in qualifying, and the tight bodywork improved airflow and made the car very generous on its tyres. Without a collision with Montoya in Monaco, Michael Schumacher would have taken a record-breaking 13 consecutive wins, and he secured his 7th driver's title and Ferrari's 6th consecutive constructor's title. BAR saw a significant uptake in form. Their Honda V10 went up to 960 brake horsepower at 18,700 RPM, and Jenson Button took 10 podiums and Takuma Sato won. Ferrari's dominance meant none of these were wins, however, but they still finished second in the Constructors' Championship. Renault as well stepped up. They raised their engine back up to a 72-degree V angle, and while not the most powerful, it was very reliable, with numerous podiums, and test driver Heikki Hovalainen used it to lap the Top Gear test track in under a minute, whilst disguised as the Stig. Williams tried something new with a short nose cone flanked by wide-set spurs, which became known as the Walrus nose. It didn't have the desired effects, and they eventually reverted to a conventional nose design, but the car still had plenty of power, now approaching 1,000 brake horsepower. Montoya broke his own average lap speed record from 2 years earlier at Monza, and won the final round, while Ralf Schumacher missed several races after breaking his back in a crash at Indianapolis. McLaren ran a debugged version of the MP418, which initially was terrible, but a major mid-season revision introduced a design more close to the original concept, and Räikkönen got a win at Spa, but they were a lowly 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Little changed at the back of the grid, but Minardi ran a modified version of the Arrows A23 from 2002 and were once again slowest. In 2005, Michael Schumacher and Ferrari's dominance came to an end, as the FIA raised the front wing height, and also banned tyre changes during races. This mainly affected Bridgestone, whose tyres were less durable than Michelin's, and were now only being used by Ferrari, Jordan and Minardi. Engines now also had to last 2 race weekends instead of 1, and an early engine replacement would necessitate a 10-place grid penalty. Qualifying was also changed again with a new aggregate system, but this was very unpopular and did not last long. These new tyre rules were put to the test at Indianapolis, where all Michelin runners withdrew on safety grounds due to the extreme risk of high-speed tyre blowouts on the circuit's banking, which meant only 6 drivers started the race, and Schumacher took his only win of the season. The title battle ended up being between Renault and McLaren. McLaren went for another radical, very aggressive design that was extremely powerful and had excellent aerodynamics, but, as McLaren had experienced for much of the V10 era, was let down by the Mercedes engine. Raikkonen 3 times retired from the lead and had to take several grid penalties, often compensating with supreme drives, but Fernando Alonso at Renault had no reliability problems at all. While their engine was less powerful, the car was very well balanced with the innovative use of a tuned mass damper in the nose cone, facilitating very low ride heights to improve downforce. Supreme consistency from Alonso meant he became, at the time, the youngest champion in Formula 1 history. Toyota shocked everyone by suddenly producing a competitive car. It was particularly good in qualifying, where the team claimed they could break 1,000 brake horsepower, with Jarno Trulli and Ralf Schumacher taking a pole each, and they also got 5 podiums, finishing best of the rest. BAR had lost their form from 2004 and then got in trouble at Imola, where they were discovered to have a second hidden fuel tank. They were given a 2-race ban, but bounced back mid-season, and Jenson Button scored points in each of the final 10 races, while Sato only did once. Their car, the 007, also set a speed record for Formula 1 cars when, in a heavily modified configuration, Alan van der Merwe drove it to 247 miles per hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats. Williams had a new driver lineup of Mark Webber and Nick Heidfeld, but were only occasionally able to break out of the midfield. After 5 difficult seasons, Ford sold Jaguar to Red Bull for £1. Red Bull had had their own junior academy since 2001 and had previously sponsored Jaguar, Sauber and Arrows. They ran a car that had been designed by Jaguar with a Cosworth engine, and it was a solid midfielder, with the team bringing a fun new image to Formula 1. Jordan was sold by Eddie Jordan to Alex Schneider of the Midland Group, though they kept the original name and identity, but did switch to Toyota engines, becoming Toyota's first customer team. The season was spent at the back battling Minardi, which effectively ended with a 3rd and a 4th at Indianapolis. In 2006, the FIA made the decision to ban V10 engines in order, once again, to cut power and slow the cars down, and mandated 2.4-litre V8s, and so the V10 era came to an end. Despite that, however, Minardi at the end of 2005 was bought by Red Bull, who transformed them into a B team called Scuderia Toro Rosso. For 2006, they ran a largely unmodified version of the Red Bull RB1 from the previous year, including with the original Cosworth V10 engine. This had to be rev limited from 19,000 RPM to 17,000 RPM, and so this hapless, otherwise unremarkable Formula 1 car that scored only a single point stands out as the last ever to run a V10 engine. Formula 1 has always tried to remain road relevant, and V10 engines had very little marketability. The extreme costs also meant that despite the explosion in manufacturer involvement in Formula 1 in the V10 era, BMW, Honda and Toyota all withdrew by the end of the decade. The 2.4-litre V8s were eventually replaced by 1.6-litre turbocharged hybrid V6s in 2014, which is where we find ourselves today. These engines are much more powerful than V10s and much more fuel efficient, but are also much larger and much heavier. The technology from them has been used in the road market with the explosion of hybrid vehicles there, more so now as fully electric cars are beginning to wane. In 2026 though, the Overton window looks to shift again as the power units will be running on carbon-neutral, sustainable fuels. 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel, who himself never raced in the V10 era, has been ahead of the game however, as through his Race Without Trace initiative he has done demonstration runs in classic Formula 1 cars retrofitted to run on carbon-neutral fuels, but elsewhere unchanged. This opens up an opportunity in the future to drop the large, heavy hybrids, and return to cars that are much lighter, smaller and nimbler, and also look, but most importantly, sound much faster. What's the old saying? Don't be sad it's gone, be glad it happened. But yeah, bring back V10s.